Hi, everyone. Welcome to the workshop on building narrative power for racial and health equity. We're going to look at the implications for public health. We are at the NACCHO annual meeting in July of 2022, and your panelists today are Rinku Sen, that's me, Executive Director of Narrative Initiative, Richard Hofrichter, who is the former Senior Director of Health Equity and Social Justice at NACCHO, and Aletha Maybank, who is the Chief Health Equity Officer and Senior Vice President at the American Medical Association. Very excited to be on a panel with these two. Our learning objectives today are to build a shared understanding of three things. The first is key topics and terms related to dominant narratives, narrative strategy, and the building of narrative power. The second is to consider from our different perspectives the relevance of narrative to transforming culture and its power for achieving health equity and racial justice. And finally, develop a shared understanding of what it means to be able to translate knowledge and experience to reimagining public health practice. As I said, I am Rinku Sen. I'm Executive Director of Narrative Initiative. And I'm going to cover some of the key definitions and concepts that Richard and Aletha will describe in detail in their presentations. So first of all, let's define narrative. What does that mean? Popular word, making the rounds, but what is it actually? At Narrative Initiative, we define narrative as the themes and ideas that permeate collections or systems of related stories. So they're the idea that is at the core of a story, but one story would never be enough to move any idea. You'd need collections of stories, different kinds of stories centering that idea, told in all kinds of venues and through lots of different structures, story structures. When those stories and those themes, with their themes embedded, are told often enough in enough different venues over a long enough period, let's say 200 or 300 years, almost anything more than 50 years, you're going to be in the land of deep narrative. Deep narratives are the themes and ideas that have become really, really, really sticky because they have become almost shorthand. So if I were to say in the United States the word bootstraps, lots of people would think about that meaning self-reliance, not relying on government subsidies, not expecting your neighbors to help you, like you're on your own. Bootstraps means that you are on your own and the individual is the primary unit, the lone individual. So these deep narratives are become really sticky and really saturating. They are everywhere in the society and you can't turn around without knocking into one. And because they're so deep and so saturating, so shared, they make the foundation of how people understand the past and also the present and what they imagine can be possible in the future, what we can actually accomplish, what are the kinds of changes we can talk about, what are the values that we want the society to be based on. So these deep narratives really help us decide who we are. They shape our identity and our sense of community and where we belong. When we do narrative work, we're going to be doing it with a lot of different disciplines and people who have expertise in many, many different areas. So no matter where you might fall on this spoke map, whether you're advocating for policies or you're organizing a membership base to protest the city council to get more money for some particular public health program, or you're doing research into the outcomes of different kinds of health practices, or you're making art and engaging people in community theater around health and racial justice, or you're analyzing data and creating apps, or you're funding, or you're teaching, or you're figuring out what to say about the work and what needs to be done. No matter where you come from in this map, you are making narrative all the time. All of us are telling stories and advancing certain ideas through those stories. And knowing that, our goal at Narrative Initiative is to equip all these different kinds of people, activists, organizers, scholars, funders, policymakers, to be able to make really solid decisions about the narrative, about the ideas and morals and stories that you're going to be using the most in your work. If we want to build real power to shift narratives, to make the ideas and goals that we have, the solutions that we're pushing, popular and implementable and winnable, then usually we need more than one person or a small set of narrators and communicators to be producing those collections of stories, those hundreds and thousands of stories that are all making the same point, like in the public health world, making the point that we're all actually connected. My body is connected to my neighbor's body in a quite literal way. Well, maybe not quite literal, but yes, in a environmental way. So we want to, build narrative power by unleashing millions of new and self-determining and really skilled narrators in communities all over the country. So at Narrative Initiative, we think of ourselves as narrative organizers, and some of the work that we take groups of people through and engage in ourselves are on this slide. The first thing we're often going to do is landscape the narrative terrain. We're going to want to be looking at the same map if we're going to be planning for taking action together. And that map should give us a sense of what harmful messages and narratives are working in the world, how they're actually holding up our goals, our organizing, our advocacy, our practice changes, and who is moving those narratives, who's moving the harmful ones, who's moving the helpful ones, and what is our capacity to drive our narrative power through the vulnerabilities of the people and institutions that are pushing harmful narratives. So we are usually going to start with landscaping, doing kind of a strength and weaknesses analysis of both the infrastructure behind narratives we don't like and also narratives that we do like. We want to have that shared landscape, that shared picture, so that we can make sense of it together and talk about our strategic options and hopefully align behind a clear set of options. We often call the process of setting narrative goals the narrative North Star process. So that's where you are thinking about, for example, replacing the narrative of individual or personal responsibility for health to systemic responsibility or collective responsibility or institutional responsibility. In order to make decisions like that, you want to go through an alignment process with whichever group of narrators you are working in and you're a part of. And finally, we want to do those first two things so that we can actually take narrative action together. I think for many people, especially those of us who are very oriented toward changing policies or very oriented toward changing a very specific practices within institutions, it can feel like changing the environment in which we do that work, changing the culture in which problems arise and get solved is very vague. That, I can see a very clear path to new legislation, or I understand the path to changing my public health department's practice on something, but changing the culture feels vague. But if we apply some of the things that we know from our other disciplines also to narrative, then we can often generate lots of shared action possibilities. And I'm going to take us through an example of one of those in a minute. So landscaping, alignment, shared action is the aim of narrative organizing. All of that to build power, to be able to change the environment and build the public will for the kinds of solutions that we know work. I want to take the opportunity to draw some distinctions between strategic communications, which many of us function in and use, and narrative strategy. So when you're doing strategic communications, the time boundary is usually short to maybe medium term. A common one is 6 months to 3 years. Another common one is the annual legislative cycle. Another common one is, the electoral cycle often sets some strategic communications needs for different people, particularly in legislative cycles, for example, budgeting cycles and budgeting debates. So stratcoms, as the cool kids call it, stratcoms is generally going to have a less than 5-year timeline, and usually it's going to be 1 to 2 years. Strategic communications are generally attached to current policy processes and demands and debates about solutions. So they're often done in the context. Strategic communications kick in the context of trying to preserve a nationwide mask mandate, for example. And policies, I'll just remind us, isn't always referring to legislation. It can also refer to regulations that don't go through a legislative process, and it can refer to institutional decision-making, for example, changes in the hiring process at a particular public agency. So stratcoms is usually done in the pursuit of a very specific set of legislative goals or policy or practice goals. And they're often done, the best strategic communications relies on the communicators being able to identify shared values with the audience that they are trying to persuade. So if your audience is AAPI immigrants, Asian American Pacific Islander immigrants, then your strategic storytelling and messaging and framing is going to be, you're going to want to identify what that audience values that matches up to the values driving your solution and speak to those. And this is where sometimes strategic communications can become quite limited, because the impetus is to speak to values that are currently widely held and understood in the same way and shared. So those are some of the characteristics of strategic communications. The characteristics of narrative strategy, the first one is a much longer timeline where we're thinking in terms of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. In 50 years, what could you change in the public will, in the values, and in the shortcuts that people make to be able to tell whether the solution being offered matches up to the values or not. So we're talking of at least 5 years and really thinking in terms of decades that we can break into smaller chunks. Narrative strategy might attach to current policy debates, but it tries to move beyond those current debates to actually create a more authorizing environment for ambitious changes. And in my experience, I have a lot of time spent in the immigrant rights movement, and I'm going to offer 2 examples of our work there. But in my experience, sometimes, no matter how hard you try in the short term, the values that are most often elevated just are not friendly to your solutions, and actually trigger the wrong kinds of solutions or the wrong characterizations of the constituency that you're working to build power for and with. So in a narrative strategy, policies are used more often as examples, inspiring examples. See, we have solutions examples. Look, we could organize ourselves and our society in this way examples, rather than with the idea that we're actually going to win this policy right now. The goal is to expand the debate rather than to win the policy. Although it is important in narrative strategy to try to do no harm to current policy debates. And then the last difference from strategic comms is that in narrative strategy, we're often trying to elevate or establish new values, new norms, to some degree, nothing in the world is new. Everything has been tried before by somebody, but there are periods in societies where certain values dominate and others don't. So we may be trying to recover and reclaim old values, redefine old values, or actually introduce and establish new values. But the key here is that we're not trying to be limited by the current set of values available to us. I'm going to give you 2 quick examples and then wrap up with how to read helpful narratives and how to read harmful narratives. When I worked at Race Forward some years ago, we did 2 projects, one that was strategic communications and one that was narrative project, but both around the issue of immigration and with the goal of building immigrant power. The Shattered Families report, which was done by our research department and published as an investigative journalism story by our news site, Color Lines, that report was the first to put a number on the amount of children who were in foster care, really solely because their parents had been deported, not because there had been neglect or abuse in the family. And that report was meant to disrupt the mass deportation policy of the Obama administration. It was meant to reframe the existing policy debate around immigration reform and border enforcement in ways that would take our eye off of law and order, move away from the law and order frames toward the family unity and human dignity frames. So, and it had many of those effects. Parental deportations and mass deportations went down by 50% the year after the report came out. A week after the report came out, President Obama was in a press briefing with Latino reporters who asked him about the report and whether he knew of it and intended to do anything about it. And he did know of it. And shortly after that, there were regulatory changes at the Border Patrol and at the Department of Health and Human Services. And there were several states that actually passed legislation related to solving this family shattering problem. The other project I want to just offer as an example was our Drop the Iword campaign, which was something we ran at Race Forward with the goal of getting the Associated Press to remove the words illegal immigrant from their style guide. So that was not tied to existing legislative fights. It was arguably trying to change. Many people who were involved in those legislative fights thought that, in fact, getting this to happen was so impossible, so far out there, that it would be a huge distraction to the legislative struggle. But long story short, we won. And in 2013, the Associated Press changed its policy that triggered a change in thousands of news outlets around the world, as well as in the United States. And they haven't gone backwards. And obviously, in the last few years, the I word has become repopularized by the anti-immigrant right. But my contention is that that would have been much, much worse in the environment if the Associated Press had not actually changed their policy. So those were two examples of one that is strat comms, one that is narrative strategy. Actually, both of them carried out by not the exact same team, but overlapping teams. So when we are creating a narrative strategy, we do these four things. There are four baskets of skills that we need to have. One is the ability to observe together. Second is the ability to create content together. When that content is created, we want to translate and test it with different audiences. And then when we are happy with the results we're getting, we deploy it. And some of this translation and testing can happen in real life terms. For example, if you are a service organization, you can always think about gathering up a few of your users, clients, members to run something by them. So here's how you recognize harmful narratives. We tend not to use the language of dominant and counter because you immediately want to know dominant with whom and counter for whom. So we use harmful and helpful. In general, harmful narratives are the ones that block progress for your people and on your issue. And they often are hoarding narratives, narratives of fear, narratives of individualism, narratives of be careful that someone doesn't come and get what's yours. Some of the criteria for helpful narratives are that they hint at ways to redistribute power and that they advance the power that everyday people have to name the narratives that they're in, to name the narratives that they want to actually use, and to tell their own stories. So some of these kinds of narratives will raise up values of humanity and the value of all people, self-determination and freedom, thriving, human rights, all of those and many more other values that we might also want to elevate so that we can actually get health equity and racial justice in this country. That is it for me, and we will transition here to our second speaker, Richard Hofrichter.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Hofrichter, formerly from NACCHO. And I'm going to be talking about the politics of narratives in a public health context, how to strengthen public health in its development of a compelling narrative. We're all socialized in narratives from birth. That is, for us, that means in a capitalist racist society. Public health has a narrative problem, not entirely of its own making, influenced, of course, by professional socialization, that constricts our ability to confront root causes of health inequity, especially in this post-truth era of erasing culture and history, and of course, attacking science and public health. Public health is sometimes imprisoned in narratives where, for example, the central approach is mitigation, programs and services treating consequences of inequity. Although absolutely necessary, it's insufficient to end the generation and reproduction of health inequities by those organized, well-networked interests that oppress populations. Yet action on the root causes is usually seen as unrealistic, outside the purview of legitimate practice. I will explore some barriers public health faces which unintentionally mirror society's harmful narratives, such as structural racism, individualism, free market ideology, and then consider the relevance of building narrative power as a strategy, which Rashad Robinson, director of Color of Change, says is the ability to create leverage over those who set the rules and norms that shape society. For public health, narrative power means using its authority to disrupt and replace narratives that prevent the social transformation we seek. To build narrative power, we can become narrative strategists who would reimagine public health practice, that is, to notice, investigate, and advance narratives for progressive cultural change, demonstrating the processes to others through dialogue to make social justice principles the common sense. Narratives get expressed through publicly shared collections of stories, as has been discussed, social rules, images, stereotypes, and very important practices in public health, in law, in education, in journalism, and so forth, and that appear in the arts, in painting, performance, poetry, architecture, that explain or define reality. More than words, they influence how we experience and interpret the world as themes in our collective consciousness, not as individuals. Narratives can hinder or promote social change by altering public consciousness to transform cultures in ways that either free social imagination for advancing just futures or crush it. They signify who and what is valuable. Harmful dominant narratives reproduce society's power structures, institutions, and values about government, the economy, negative othering of social groups by obscuring, distracting, or normalizing oppressive hierarchies. They're dominant because they saturate the whole process of living, shaping perceptions, yet appearing as neutral or self-evident. We can undermine these narratives because they're all unstable, contested, often contradictory, contingent, not self-reproducing, and therefore demand continuous validation, providing opportunity for challenge. So a few assumptions. First, narrative change is not primarily, as was said, about messaging or communications, but a shift in collective group experience we often unknowingly take for granted. Second, the work on narrative change is not an intellectual exercise, but at the heart of any social change process to embed social justice as a goal. Third, the primary determinations of inequitable health outcomes are political, economic, and social. As Elizabeth Fee shows here, she is a public health historian. So the knowledge and evidence base needs to expand in public health. There are no simple protocols for building narrative power. Strategies arise in transformative, facilitated dialogue over time. The pedagogy is to illuminate, to gain insight through discovery, not didactic learning or persuasion. The purpose is to make social injustice more visible and surmountable. Many cities, counties, and health departments declared structural racism a public health crisis, but what's the practice? It's a tall task. To succeed, public health must have a coherent, compelling narrative in a society that now centers white culture, investor needs, stock prices over human need and racial equity. A narrative where practitioners see themselves as agents of social change, citizen professionals and advocates for the public's health instead of experts. Here are some of the difficulties among many that public health faces. Again, that's not purely from its own making, but that get in the way of being able to develop that narrative, which we'll get to. The biomedical paradigm alone, which is central in public health, cannot explain the source of differences in life expectancy as shown here in communities a few miles apart. It narrows what counts as authentic evidence, excluding many relevant forms of knowledge. This familiar concept of social determinants of health, an advance over behavioral methods and personal responsibility, lacks a direct relation to the specific interests that produce social injustice. Negative aspects of unaffordable housing or toxic environments result from concentrated, unaccountable political power, not disconnected individual determinants. The poverty of bureaucratic discourse everywhere really excludes historical context and realities of political conflict. Concrete specificity gets superseded with abstract concepts about efficiency, innovation, coordination, and so on. Rarely asked is what processes and mechanisms produce the inequities. If so, answers often allude to unspecified forces or complex factors independent of organized interests. Practitioners know health inequity is a deeply oppressive social injustice, a form of violence, yet have difficulty centering that knowledge as part of a strategy. Endlessly documenting health outcomes and correlations with poverty does not itself reveal the source of injustice. Stopping the production of inequity requires social transformation and cannot remain outside the purview of legitimate practice. One problem is representing the invisibility of what some call social murder. For example, the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, banks and real estate developers who site hazardous waste primarily in communities of color. In developing narrative strategy, whenever we engage with publicly examined ideas, say news reporting, unarticulated themes and journalistic conventions define acceptable storylines. The narratives are often hard to detect because they're familiar and not always intentional. A tension exists between, for example, relying on plain language and modes of storytelling as in journalism versus the use of challenging artistic renderings or inventive language and imagery to explain or represent new or difficult ideas. Einstein's theory of relativity was an extraordinary narrative shift about the origins and nature of the universe. The problem with seemingly plain language is that it can still be confining in explanations and interpretations already dominant about why inequality exists. This slide is a simple example. We want to overcome pre-existing common assumptions about human nature, gender, race, class, and so forth that limit expectations about what is possible and desirable. Attention to narrative helps avoid negatively positioning people in ways that confirm the validity of dominant narratives by unknowingly engaging inside their values, categories, and ideologies, such as cost-benefit analysis or referring to groups of people being at risk instead of subjected to risk. We must refuse these frames and not be captured by them if we are to represent unobservable injustice inherent in racist legacies. Ta-Nehisi Coates hints at how concepts of tolerance, bias, and white privilege can deflect attention from the exploitation and violence to Black and brown bodies at a structural level, which is where we're trying to go. We need to communicate ideas independent of established systems of inquiry without becoming captive to narratives which foreclose choices. In these nondescript paragraphs from a document describing how health practitioners should become chief health strategists, notice the implication that increases in health disparities arise from demographic change without explanation about why some will experience greater inequities. Pure stereotyping. Why would demographic shifts result in negative socioeconomic changes? This is white supremacy culture in action. These euphemisms demonstrate the ideology of market rationality, so common and ubiquitous, we hardly notice. And as was mentioned, individualism still dominates in public health, with a stress on behavior change and personal responsibility. This chart shows how individualism combines with racism. I'll give you a chance to look at that for a moment. So what is to be done? What coherent narratives should be advanced? The challenge, as writer Rob Nixon says, is representational. How to devise arresting, urgent, dramatic stories, images, and symbols to draw our attention, centering voices who experience oppression. So reclaiming public health social justice legacy includes creating closer ties between public health and social movements, a clear trajectory for change, and a compelling narrative and infrastructure to support it, with powerful stories from communities. How do we begin to transform the culture in public health through narrative? Briefly, these are some dimensions of a compelling narrative for advancing health equity. And I'm just going to work on two. Conventionally, some public health practitioners see themselves as objective scientists, first responders, who provide essential services. But there can be no neutral stance for health inequity. Becoming change agents also means striving to end social injustice with a narrative that reorients professional identity as champions for the public good, a force for social justice, expressing moral courage. Creating strong alliances with commitment means more than passive community engagement. A change agent is the co-leader with community residents to move agendas, who envisions options where no one else sees them, instilling ideas about the social health of communities. Building narrative power is part of that role. The change sought is attentive to those organized networks of power as we struggle now to maintain what's left of democracy. The redefinition of health would highlight whose health gets priority and for what ends, whether to create a healthy workforce to satisfy the needs of capital or a flourishing, thriving human existence where people can achieve their fullest capabilities, leading to physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. In some sense, health is deeply tied to a conception of human liberation. Historian Christopher Hamlin describes a broad meaning of health from the 1840s, still relevant today. So how do we reimagine practice to establish a society that supports a conception of health? What values does it support? What priorities would flow from these values? Here are a few overlapping elements to consider. And these are probably linked in many ways. And there are probably others that I know some of you could also add to this list. So to build narrative power, practitioners can shape a narrative with social justice leaders connecting their historical links to political activism, one which reckons with and rectifies its past racism, as well as today's white supremacy culture. Public health can liberate itself from constrictive conventions and expose the interests that generate and sustain social injustice. It can catalyze expectations, justifying its role in all aspects of social life, instilling a culture of health equity directly accountable to the public. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Letha Maybank, Chief Health Equity Officer and Senior Vice President at the American Medical Association. I'm going to speak with you a little bit on the kind of the practical and operational side of narrative work. I just want to acknowledge Richard Hofrichter, because I learned much of what I know about narrative from his expertise and his leadership, and just being a colleague over these many years, and just really want to thank him for the contributions that he's really made in this space in public health for many of us. First, I'm going to start off with a land and labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are all living off the stolen ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. We acknowledge the extraction of brilliance, energy, and life for forced labor upon people of African descent for more than 400 years. And we celebrate the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people and descendants of Africa have shown in this country and worldwide. And we carry our ancestors in us, and we are continually called to be better as we lead this work. And I just want to also highlight these photos because I think photos are important as we speak about narrative, because photos can be interpreted in many ways, but photos also clearly tell a story that is very important to our advancement, and also kind of seeing those who have been historically marginalized, and they're centered and they're present and they're visible. And the top photo are students who are going to med school, and they're from the Oregon Health and Science University's program for Native American Center for Excellence that aims to increase American Indian and Indigenous young folks into the healthcare space. And then the bottom photo was taken probably about 3 years ago now, because all of them have graduated from med school this last year. And these are students who are at Tulane, and they wanted to kind of reclaim who they were and connect to who they are and their history and their ancestors, and recognizing that they're standing on the shoulder of their ancestors. This is at Whitney Plantation, close to the university itself. And the photo ended up actually going pretty viral. So at the American Medical Association, founded in 1847, its mission is to promote the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. We have been an organization that clearly has had some influence and some impact, and an organization that also has some history, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but definitely an organization that has set the foundations for narratives that have been established in our healthcare and medicine space for almost 200 years. We're at our 175th anniversary, so 175 years at least. And so in the recent years, the House of Delegates of the American Medical Association came together and really felt we needed to be more explicit and intentional in the role that AMA had in equity. And so this is why the Center for Health Equity was started. I'm its inaugural director, and I've been on board now for 3 years. I started in 2019. Equity is considered an accelerator. In other words, every aspect of the organization is engaged in equity, from our membership team that works on behalf of the members, our management team, which works on behalf of our members, and then the healthcare community at large. But it is very clear to everyone, this is everyone's work. But we do have a lot of work, and a lot of our work is due to kind of our historical, again, narrative around and truths around our explicit exclusion of Black physicians for many years, and I'll come back and talk about that. But I'm going to talk about kind of the story of since I've been on, it's really since COVID started, and I think many of us have had this experience in the equity space of now having a lot of attention towards us. COVID exposed those inequities to many who did not know about them, and then the murder and the public murder of George Floyd then kind of exposed and ignited this larger conversation around racism, and especially racism as a public health threat. So during the time of COVID, you know, I was hearing a lot from people that they wanted to hear and they needed to hear more from, especially physicians who have been historically and racially marginalized throughout the years about, you know, their experiences. What are they going through? How are things, you know, happening? And so we evolved and started a series called Prioritizing Equity, in which we have varying hosts. Sometimes I'm the host. Sometimes you see my team member here, Fernando DeMayo's the host, of just engaging folks around topics like narrative and language at this time, or the myth of meritocracy. And we launched an education center to help support really building that muscle per se for the physician community and healthcare community to have a better understanding of not just language, but the concepts that are surrounding and grounding the language that we're using in medicine, and how it can be helpful or how it could be harmful. My transition from public health more so into healthcare space allowed me to see like a really big difference in how healthcare was showing up. And a lot of the narratives within healthcare and still are pretty kind of dominant and malignant narratives or harmful narratives, as you've heard already in this conversation. And so it was really important as I moved forward in kind of building the Center for Health Equity that we really set that bar, but also a foundation on to help us have the ability to have a shared analysis around all these concepts of equity that were being thrown out in so many different ways. And they were becoming jargon: social determinants of health, disparities, equity. They were just used in so many different ways. And so we needed to really start setting and creating this shared analysis and understanding. We had an incident that happened, excuse me, at the process of COVID as well, after the public murder. And about last year, in March, our Journal of American Medical Association had a podcast that was posted that really talked about how, one, physicians aren't racist, and that why are we talking about racism and questioning that. And so that really spun many of us, and rightfully so, in many different directions, but important directions, to really start to interrogate and challenge how our institutions are showing up, and how our institutions that are responsible for putting forth communications and narratives, more specifically, about what is creating health, what's creating problems, where are these problems coming from, what is the evidence that's being created to share and demonstrate that these are the problems. And so when we look specifically at racism as an example, at that time, it really demonstrated that the majority of our medical journals, there are 4 major medical journals across the world, were not only using the word racism, but they weren't publishing any articles that were empirical on racism. And that's pretty problematic for the medical community, because the majority of where they get their important ideas and evidence to create guidelines and protocols comes from peer review journals. And so if there's a huge gap in understanding this root cause of what causes inequities, and they aren't publishing empirical data, then there is a certain level of ignorance that is absolutely there. And that is potentially harmful as well. And so, it demonstrated, and you can see the data here, I won't go through it, but this is a form of how we started to challenge what our systems of who, definitely are in the role and responsibility of hoping to support building narratives, what they were doing. And so AMA in the fall of 2020 actually passed policy. And I heard Riku mention this in her talk about how policies, can be used to really shape narrative and push a narrative forward, especially when the narrative has been wrong before. And this was an example of it. First, again, the public murder of George Floyd, the statement on the right-hand side came out. And then the House of Delegates, really led by the medical student section, put these policies forward, and they were passed. And it was really, folks were very, somewhat surprised that AMA went this route. But I think for me, the second one was really the most important and the most that we've been able to really rely on, because that's one that really kind of shifts the language and shifts the narrative about race and what it is and what it's not, and how race cannot be used solely as a factor per se, and how we understand disease, and that we have to understand it more so as a marker, but we need to eliminate it mostly as a proxy for ancestry, genetics, biology, and research. So with those policies, it actually opened the door for us within the Center for Health Equity to really push forward pretty boldly in how we were going to communicate a strategic plan for the AMA for the next 2 years. And this is an 80-page document. It's not typical for a strategic plan to be that long, but I heard this mentioned earlier too. The first part of it was really about a primer, because the realities, again, there's just such different understandings about these concepts of health equity and justice and racism, and a lot of discomfort, truthfully, as well. And so we wanted to spend the time in the first half of the document to make sure that we outlined these concepts in great detail, so that there could be, again, a shared analysis in understanding what our ultimate strategic plan would be, what the approaches would be, what the actions would be, and why are we going that direction. Without that kind of base information, folks would have completely been, I think, really pretty confused, especially in an environment that really didn't talk that much about racial justice and health equity. And so we have these 5 approaches that we are moving forward. I won't go in depth in most of them, except for the last one soon. But embedding equity in all of our practices, building alliances and sharing power, ensuring equity and innovation, pushing upstream and fostering truth and reconciliation, and pathways to transform and to reconcile for our past. And so as we were building out this document, we thought also, important, and you've heard this mentioned, I've been in the school of Richard Hofrichter, so I used to dominant narrative, but we've also used malignant narrative, and there's harmful narratives. But to say that they are throughout all of our institutions, they generate social and political and economic inequality, and they marginalize and really silence voices, especially those with limited power. And their effect is really obscuring power and responsibility. And we thought this was a really important concept for the physician community to understand, as they are kind of in a community that has typically had a pretty much power, not just AMA, but physician communities overall for generations, and power in terms of politically for AMA, but power also financially for AMA, but also for physicians as a whole in the healthcare system. But we know that many of these dominant and malignant narratives in health really undermine the ability for us to really get to equity and drive equity. And here are a list of some of those kind of and dominant narratives that exist. Self-determining individuals make right or wrong lifestyle choices. And Dr. Kamara Jones talks a lot about this, and this is aligned with some of what she says and some of what we've been saying as well as we've been doing this work. But picking yourself up in bootstraps, which we heard earlier, in the myth of meritocracy, the zero-sum game comes up often. And then just the false notion of a hierarchy of human value based on skin color known as white supremacy. So we took our time to make sure that, we've been educating our physicians through kind of tools and documents. And so our strategic plan was our first one. We made sure it was part of our theory of change and how we do our work and what we think is important in order to advance equity. There were several other theories of change that are listed there, but you can see challenge malignant and dominant narratives pervasive in health. The next kind of tool we put out was the narrative guide. So actually, and thanks to Richard and several other folks who helped partner on this with us, we were able to issue this in the fall of 2021. And it's a guide to language and narrative concepts. And this was in partnership with the American Association of Medical Colleges. And you can see that we really focused on these 3 areas. Sorry about that. These 3 areas, sorry. My screen for some reason is ticking. Okay, these 3 areas. Well, the first one was really kind of geared towards kind of understanding and describing, again, what narrative is about, recognizing the limitations of and the consequences of when we use certain words and phrases explicitly. And then why not narratives matter. And then there was a whole glossary of terms. And we did lots of promotion around this, both from both institutions. Now, what doesn't get talked about often in doing this work, and I think this is just becomes more and more relevant as we move forward in our society and at this present day, is once that document was released, there was lots of folks who weren't appreciative of us challenging narrative. And I've learned that it is once we start to challenge narrative, that is where we get the most resistance, because it is narrative what holds power, what is able to keep folks oppressed. then it's narrative that is used in order to do that. And so once you start to challenge the narratives that others have put forward to oppress, they will push back on it very quickly. And so, you know, there were plenty of articles. There were articles within the right wing side. There were news articles absolutely almost everywhere when this document came out. And it almost would seem and overshadow all the good reception from this document as well. And we've heard from many med schools that have actually taken this document, broken it down, and made some curriculum out of it. And then even mainstream news, you know, whom, you know, where we hear of most also had articles posted. But my sense is, and what happens is that there's an organizing strategy that happened in order to get placement into these types of entities. Not that they wouldn't publish it, but there was a clear organizing and a movement behind making sure that folks were aware that they were not happy with this document. And some of them were absolutely physicians because it was, you know, AMA released it, but I think it spread to the larger society. And what I elevate now is just them, you know, these attacks that are increasing towards people who are leading this work and doing narrative change work. And I've heard and I've expressed before the challenges that I've had after that guide was released, to the point that I have to have security detail when I go to different places to do presentations now because of an incident or a couple incidents that happened pretty close to my home, actually at my home. So, you know, I think this is a time when we talk about and people who are leading narrative change work, we also need to talk about organizing and operating in solidarity. And, you know, we're doing this presentation, for folks who don't know, on the same day of which the Supreme Court came out with their ruling on Roe v. Wade. And it is very clear that our strategy in order to really advance equity at this point in time can only be through narrative change organizing and through solidarity and action around that. And this particular photo was a photo of some neo-Nazis showed up at Brigham's to demonstrate and to against the work that they were doing on critical race theory within their institution. And so this is just showing a moment of solidarity, but in all honesty, there was a lot of silence as well across the healthcare community when this happened. And so when we start to do narrative change work in very real and meaningful ways, we also have to be prepared to not only support and protect ourselves, but support and protect each other, and also not be silent. We are fortunate to have some great allies, or accomplices, I prefer to say, who did publish pieces about the narrative guide that were really helpful, you know, for us in moving forward. This is George Lundberg was the former editor-in-chief at JAMA at one point in time. And this actually very much surprised me that he wrote this piece. And I emailed him and I thanked him, and he said somebody had to do it, and it was about time, because he could see all that was swirling within the community. And so AMA, as I said, we're at our 175th anniversary. And a lot of the work that we also need to do now is kind of to look back, and again, fostering those pathways for truth, reconciliation, and healing. And I think this is also really connected to the narrative change work. We couldn't get to kind of an agreement or an acceptance of doing this work unless the narrative, everybody kind of had a shared analysis around the story of what happened and why it happened. And so I think we've done a lot of good work in a very short time to get the AMA to a point where, you know, we were able to have this particular approach within the strategic plan very explicitly, and about repairing the wrongs from the past, and making sure we're amplifying those voices and narratives of those who have been historically marginalized, and quantifying the impacts of AMA policies. And there was an apology that was issued for the exclusion of Black physicians, which you saw a little while ago. That was our first kind of step in 2008. And then recently, last year, there was a statue that was removed, because the statues also are a representation of structural violence, and they have narratives and dominant narratives and harmful narratives attached to them as well. of which are embodied by people that can be very harmful, because the messages are saying, I don't value you and I don't care. And when they're in institutions of which we work, it can be very difficult. And so Dr. Madera, who's the CEO of AMA, when he read some articles about the actual history and heard that the father of AMA was actually very explicit and very intentional about the exclusion of Black physicians, he removed actually the entire bust from an archives that was on, not the archives, entire bust from a exhibit rather, that was on one of the floors at the AMA, and sent them to archives for educational reasons and for purpose. And we also removed the name of Nathan Davis from the award. The other piece of history that we have as the AMA is commissioning the Flexner Report of 1910, which completely revolutionized medical education, also contributed to the shutting down of 5 of the 7 med schools at that time, took out the social science piece of medical education. It was only now, and it still is that way mostly, about basic and clinical science. We see some evolution more recently, but it has impacted how doctors show up, the narratives that they use actually that impact policy, it impacts funding, because the narrative of health is really focused most of the time on the healthcare system and within the walls of hospitals and doctors' offices. And we all really know in public health, it's much more broader than that. But that's a really important narrative that stems from this history of this report that was commissioned by the American Medical Association. So we recognized the harm of the Flexner Report officially via policies last summer, of what it did to historically Black medical schools, the diversity of the physician workforce, and the outcomes of our patients as well. And then recently, also this year, they also recommended for a task force to be set up to actually go through the process of truth, reconciliation, and healing for the AMA. And so we're working on that. As I begin to close out, we're going through this process of looking at our history and understanding how we contributed to harmful narratives in health that were in science, that were racist. And so Harvard actually just released a tremendous report, Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. And we were looking through it. And when we were looking through it, I mean, this was, I think, last month, we saw a section called Race Science, in which they actually had explicit explanations and historical context of how Harvard Medical School was, contributing to race-based or racist science, or race science as they called it then. And there were 3 individuals. Some of the individuals were named that were contributing greatly, and that were at the Harvard School. And so we thought, well, let's look in our archives at AMA and just see if any of these folks were AMA members or leaders. And here they all actually were. And it really, to me, speaks to the complexity, but it also speaks to, again, this opportunity to truth tell in a way that is very deep. It's going to be really hard for people, probably even hard for the institution as a whole, to hear some of these truths that, these 3 particular individuals specifically actually set some of the foundations for race science that attributed biological differences to the inferiority of Black folks. And for that reason, they should be marginalized. Those were their explicit words. And they were excluded actually from being able to get into med schools, Black folks at that time, because of that rationale and the leadership of these 3 individuals. So all these things, we as AMA have to consider. And as I close out, just talk about and elevate J. Marion Sims, because it kind of keeps coming up in my kind of life, in my professional life and in personal life in many ways. So many of us heard of J. Marion Sims through Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington's book that was published almost over 10 years ago now at this point. And there's a statue that was in Central Park at that time. And again, a statue represents a narrative and a form of structural violence. But this is a painting that was done, and they represent 3 women who were enslaved, Betsy, Lucy, and Arca, which he well documented that they were multiple surgeries done without anesthesia. So there were calls from the community for years and years. This is in Central Park in Harlem, for these things to be taken down, or for his statue to be removed. And it took years and years and years. And it was really, I think it was after the shooting within Charleston years ago, a couple years back, of which it kind of sparked across the country, a lot of cities kind of evaluating their monuments. And so out of all the monuments, they did a whole commission, and this was the one that actually was recommended to be taken down. And so this was the day it was taken down in New York City. And that's Harriet Washington actually in the middle, and Lynn Roberts from Sister Song. And one of the, Sister Song really founded and started the reproductive justice movement. We were all present that day. And this woman on the right-hand side was running by. She runs by it every day. And when she saw it was coming off, she turned to me and asked for a hug. She's like, I just want a hug. I don't know who she was or anything. But she says, every time I run by here, I feel traumatized because I know the stories, I know the narratives he put forward about Black women of not experiencing pain as much as white women, and feeling like we could tolerate it, and all these procedures. So that has a lot of impact. And now shifting, so this is Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. I was there about 2 months ago to visit the Legacy Museum, but also to visit some other opportunities and sites. And so this is where J. Marion Sims actually practiced. And so what I learned from coming to the AMA is that J. Marion Sims was a former president of AMA. And so even more so, I feel very compelled to elevate this story and to make sure something is done about this narrative in history. But this is the monument that still remains in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's been a lot of organizing, again, for years, in the same way that there was in Harlem. There are folks who have been organizing in Alabama. This is Michelle Broader, an artist who created this beautiful masterpiece. Highly recommend folks to go check it out, in honor of Betsy, Lucy, and Arca, to center the voices and to value these folks and women who were most marginalized and most harmed. She has been advocating for years for the statue to be taken down. And so now in AMA, I'm very engaged in like the local medical societies, because they're all across the country. And so the Alabama Medical Society, and honestly, I'm pleasantly surprised by this, visited earlier this year the site where Michelle created. And this is a picture of them on tour. And I think it really moved them and impacted them in how they heard about the stories, because they actually, so if you look at kind of the document on the right-hand side, it was the Alabama Medical Association, which is affiliate of the AMA, that actually donated and gave this statue in 1939 to the Alabama Capitol. But now in this, as it says in "But Be It Resolved," that the Medical Association confront the wrongs of its past recognition of Dr. Sims and pursue available avenues to have Sims' statue removed from the Capitol grounds. So this was just passed, like literally within the last couple of weeks. And so there's going to be, I think, hopefully a good commitment and push to really challenge this narrative and this dominant and harmful narrative that definitely is putting forward continued violence upon the communities that are living in and around Alabama, but also in other places when the knowledge is there. So thank you for listening, and have a good day.